The colony was small, built on the edge of known space, far away from the busy trade routes and the protection of the great fleets. It was a mining outpost, nothing more, with workers who lived simple lives, cutting rock, extracting minerals, and sending them back to the core worlds. 4 years, nothing unusual ever happened there. The colony was quiet, forgotten by most, left alone in the silence of the stars. But then, one night, the silence was broken. A signal went out. A single desperate transmission, short and sharp, a cry for help. Distress beacons were common in deep space. Most of them came from ships that had broken down or colonies that had power failures. Usually, they were boring, routine, nothing to fear. But this one was different. This one felt wrong. The message carried no voice, no explanation, only a code that repeated again and again, as if it was alive. A human crew was the first to pick it up. Their ship was small, not part of any fleet, just explorers traveling between systems, carrying supplies and trade. At first, they thought it was nothing. Just another broken machine calling for repairs. But as they listened, they noticed the signal's strange rhythm. It was too perfect, too sharp, almost like it was timed to the beat of a heart. And under the static, if one listened carefully, there was something else, something that felt like a whisper, low and cold. The captain of the crew frowned as the sound played again. He had heard distress signals many times in his life, but this one made him uneasy. His navigator shifted uncomfortably, her hands gripping the edge of her console. The engineer muttered that it didn't sound like any beacon he had ever heard. Still, it was their duty to respond. Human law was clear. A distress call, no matter from where, must be answered. They changed course toward the distant colony, setting their engines to full burn. None of them spoke for a while. The silence in the cabin was heavy, broken only by the repeating signal. Outside their ship, the stars drifted past, cold and endless. Hours turned into days as they crossed the void, but the signal never faded. In fact, the closer they came, the stronger it grew, almost as if it was guiding them. The crew tried to contact the colony, but there was no answer. No voice, no response, nothing but that repeating code. They checked the galactic database, searching for records of the outpost. They found only one small entry, a mining colony built 50 years ago, with a population of less than 300. There were no records of recent shipments, no reports of activity, nothing for the past 5 years. It was as if the place had been abandoned. Yet the beacon pulsed on, steady and strong. Whispers spread through the crew. The navigator remembered rumors from other captains, stories of fleets that had once followed strange signals and never returned. The engineer laughed nervously, calling it nonsense, but his hands trembled as he worked. Even the captain felt something heavy in his chest, a weight he could not shake. Still, he told himself it was just fear of the unknown. Humans were explorers. They had faced worse than a broken beacon. And yet, the unease did not leave them. As their ship entered the outer edge of the system, the signal grew louder, filling the cabin like a voice calling their names. The stars around them seemed darker, the space between them colder. The navigator whispered that it felt like the galaxy itself was holding its breath. The colony came into view at last. A small world, covered in gray rock, with faint scars of mining operations cut deep into its surface. The orbiting station hung above it, lifeless and dark, with no lights, no movement, no traffic. The captain ordered a scan, but the results made little sense. The station had power, but no systems were online. The colony below showed no signs of life. No heat signatures, no signals, nothing. It was a dead world. And yet, the beacon continued to cry, strong and clear. The crew exchanged uneasy looks. If there were no people, then who was sending the signal? The engineer suggested it was just an automated beacon left running after the colony had been abandoned. But if that were true, why was the transmission so strong, so sharp, so recent? The captain leaned forward, staring at the screen. His gut told him something was wrong, but he also knew turning away was not an option. Humans did not ignore cries for help. He gave the order to prepare for descent. The ship angled downward, engines burning as they dropped into the colony's orbit. The gray surface of the planet rose to meet them, the mining scars cutting across the land like open wounds. From above, the colony buildings looked small and broken, half buried in dust and shadows. Still, the beacon pulsed, louder now, echoing in their ears like a heartbeat that did not belong. The crew said nothing. Fear pressed in on them, thick and heavy. But still, they followed the signal, not knowing that what waited below would change everything they thought they knew about the galaxy. The human ship moved carefully into the orbit of the silent colony, its engines humming softly as the crew stared at the lifeless world below. The beacon still pulsed, a steady cry that echoed through their systems, but the colony itself gave no sign of life. The captain ordered a sweep with long-range sensors, hoping to catch even the faintest signal, but the results were the same as before, empty. No life forms, no activity, only cold stone and silent machines. The navigator whispered that something about the silence felt wrong, heavier than normal, as if the very air around the planet was thick with secrets. The engineer tried to laugh it off, saying colonies failed all the time, people left, systems broke, nothing unusual. But his eyes kept shifting to the comms console, where the beacon signal flickered like a heartbeat that did not belong. Hours passed as they orbited the world, running scans, searching for survivors, trying every frequency they could think of. No one answered. It was as if the people had simply vanished. The captain thought back to the stories he had once heard, stories passed by traders in dark corners of spaceports, tales of ships that followed strange signals and never came back. He had always dismissed them as drunken myths, the kind of stories spacers told to scare each other. But now, as he looked at the dead colony, those stories felt real. Still, he could not turn back. The law was clear, and more than that, his own conscience demanded it. If even one person was alive down there, it was their duty to help. The navigator glanced at him nervously, her voice low as she asked if he was sure about this. He nodded, though in his chest the unease grew heavier. They prepared the landing sequence, but before they could descend, something strange happened. The beacon stopped. The steady pulse that had guided them across the void suddenly cut out, leaving only silence in the cabin. For a long moment no one moved. The navigator's fingers hovered over her console, the engineer swore under his breath, and the captain felt his heart skip. Then, without warning, the signal came back. Louder. Sharper. It was as if the beacon had noticed them, as if it had been waiting. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. Machines did not behave this way. Automated beacons did not turn themselves off and on, not unless someone was controlling them. But the scans showed nothing. No life, no ships, no power readings beyond the beacon itself. It made no sense. The captain ordered them to continue. They descended slowly toward the colony, engines pushing through the thin atmosphere, dust rising below as their ship broke the silence of the dead world. The closer they came, the more they saw. Buildings half collapsed, machinery rusted and broken, streets covered in dust as if no foot had walked there for years. The colony looked not just abandoned, but erased, stripped of life and purpose. And yet, the beacon burned bright from the central tower, shining like an eye watching their every move. They landed near the edge of the settlement, the ship's landing gear crushing the dusty ground. The silence was deep, pressing into their ears, broken only by the faint hum of their own machines. The captain ordered the airlocks open, and the crew stepped out in full suits, their helmets reflecting the dead world around them. Every sound echoed, the crunch of boots on stone, the hiss of air valves, the faint crackle of their radios. It felt less like walking into an empty place and more like stepping into a grave. They moved toward the main street, weapons ready, eyes scanning every shadow. The engineer muttered that he hated it here, that the silence was too heavy, too perfect. The navigator said nothing, but her hands tightened on her rifle. The captain kept his face calm, but inside his chest the weight pressed harder. They reached the first building, its doors broken, its windows shattered. Inside, they found tools left on tables, machines half-assembled, meals frozen in decay. It was as if the people had been working one moment and gone the next. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just absence. The silence grew worse. Every step they took felt louder, every movement echoed like thunder. They pushed deeper into the colony, following the signal toward the central tower. As they walked, the captain thought again about the rumors. Fleets that vanished. Colonies erased. Whispers that some things in the galaxy were older, darker, waiting in the silence. He had never believed, not until now. The tower loomed above them, tall and sharp, its beacon light pulsing with unnatural strength. They entered through the cracked doors, climbing the narrow stairs. The walls were marked with strange scratches, deep and rough, as if claws had dragged across them. The engineer touched one, then pulled his hand away quickly, shivering. The navigator asked what could have made marks like that, but no one answered. At last, they reached the control room. The beacon machine stood at the center, glowing faintly, its console alive with strange patterns. The engineer moved forward, studying the controls. He said it was broadcasting on every channel at once, far more powerful than any standard distress beacon. But the strange thing was that it had no power source. The colony's reactors were long dead, the station above was dark, yet this beacon burned bright, running on something unseen. The crew felt the weight of silence pressing in again. It was not normal silence. It was alive, heavy, watching. The captain ordered a full scan, but the devices only spat back static. Then, without warning, the signal changed. No longer a steady pulse, but a series of tones, sharp and cold. The navigator froze. She swore she heard words hidden in the noise, whispers that spoke in a language she could not understand, yet somehow felt in her bones. The engineer backed away from the machine, muttering that it was wrong, all wrong, that no beacon should act like this. The captain clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. He had thought they were answering a cry for help. But now, standing in the heart of the dead colony, listening to the whispers inside the static, he realized something terrible. This was no ordinary distress signal. This was something else. Something waiting. Something calling. The crew stood in the tower, staring at the strange beacon as its light pulsed and the sound filled their ears. The whispers inside the static grew sharper, almost like voices now, rising and falling in rhythms that felt alive. The captain ordered the engineer to shut it down, but when he tried the controls did not respond. The machine seemed to ignore him, its screens flashing symbols that none of them could understand. The navigator whispered that she felt sick, like the sound was crawling inside her head. The engineer cursed, pulling wires, cutting power, but still the beacon burned. It was not running on the colony's systems. It was running on something else, something unseen. The captain made the order to leave, his instincts screaming that they were in danger. They rushed back down the tower stairs, their boots echoing in the hollow silence. Outside, the colony streets stretched before them, empty and gray, but now the silence felt different. It was no longer just heavy, it was watching. Every shadow seemed deeper, every corner sharper, as if the buildings themselves leaned closer. The navigator froze suddenly, pointing to the ground. The dust near the edge of the street was disturbed, marked by lines that looked like trails, as if something large had been dragged across the colony. The captain studied the marks and saw they were fresh. Something had moved here not long ago. The crew tightened their grips on their weapons, moving slowly through the streets. They passed more buildings, each filled with abandoned things, meals left uneaten, machines left running until they broke. It was as if life had been stolen in an instant. The engineer muttered that it made no sense. If people had left, why leave everything behind? If they had been attacked, where were the signs of battle? Where were the bodies? The captain did not answer. He felt his chest tighten as the whispers from the beacon still echoed faintly in their comms. Then, without warning, their radios crackled. A new sound came through, not the beacon but something else. A low voice, distorted and broken, speaking in fragments. The words were unclear, but the tone was unmistakable. It was fear. The navigator swore it was human, someone calling for help. The crew froze. The captain tried to respond, sending a message back, but there was no answer. Only the broken fragments, repeating again and again. They turned toward the direction of the signal, moving carefully, their weapons raised. The streets twisted, leading them deeper into the colony, closer to the mining fields. As they walked, the air grew colder, their breath fogging the inside of their helmets. The buildings here were even more broken, their walls marked with scratches, their doors torn from hinges. The engineer stopped to study one of the marks. They were deep, too deep for any human tool. Something with strength beyond theirs had made them. Something large. The crew said nothing, but the silence between them was heavy. They kept moving until they reached the edge of the mines. The ground opened into a wide pit, scars carved deep into the planet's surface. Machines lay broken at the edges, their arms twisted, their engines dead. But the strangest thing was the pit itself. It was not empty. At the center, half buried in shadow, something vast moved. The crew froze at the sight. The shape was impossible to understand, shifting as if it was made of smoke and metal, alive and not alive at the same time. The captain felt his heart pound as the whispers from the beacon grew louder, echoing in his helmet until he almost dropped to his knees. The navigator whispered that it was looking at them. Though it had no eyes, they all felt its gaze. The engineer stumbled back, his hands shaking, muttering that it was wrong, not natural, not from this world. Then the voice returned through the radio. This time it was clearer, a human voice, crying for help. It came from the pit, from the shadow of the thing that moved there. The captain's blood ran cold. Someone was alive, trapped down there. He had sworn to never leave a cry for help unanswered, but his instincts screamed at him to run. The navigator begged him not to go closer, the engineer shouted that it was a trap, but the voice in the radio kept crying, desperate, broken, begging. The captain clenched his fists, torn between duty and survival. Before he could decide, the thing in the pit shifted. The ground trembled, dust rising as the vast shadow stretched higher. The whispers became a roar, filling their ears until they almost screamed. Lights across the colony flickered to life, broken machines sparking as if something had awakened them. The beacon in the tower blazed brighter, sending its pulse across the galaxy. The captain grabbed his crew, shouting for them to retreat. They ran back through the streets, the ground shaking beneath their feet. Behind them, the whispers followed, pressing into their minds, cold and sharp. The engineer tripped, the navigator pulled him up, and together they stumbled toward their ship. The colony was no longer silent. It was alive with echoes, voices that were not voices, shadows that moved in impossible ways. They reached the landing site, their ship standing like a lifeline in the gray dust. But as they approached, the captain saw movement at its edge. Figures, dark and twisted, shifting in and out of the shadows. They stood still, waiting, watching, their shapes unclear but their presence undeniable. The captain froze, his crew gathering close, their weapons raised. The whispers grew louder until they were almost words. Then, as the beacon pulsed once more, the figures stepped forward. The crew froze as the dark figures moved closer to their ship, their shapes twisting in the dim light, never fully clear, shifting like smoke yet heavy like flesh. The captain ordered his team to hold their ground, weapons raised, but inside he knew weapons might not be enough. The whispers in their helmets grew sharper, pressing against their thoughts, forming words they could almost understand but wished they could not. The navigator gripped her rifle tightly, her breathing heavy, while the engineer whispered prayers under his breath. The captain tried to send another signal for help, but their comms were filled with nothing but static. The figures came closer, and now they could see them more clearly. They looked almost human, but wrong. Their bodies were stretched, their movements uneven, and their faces blurred, as if something had tried to copy the shape of a human but had failed. The engineer gasped as one of the creatures tilted its head, and for just a moment, he swore he saw his own reflection in its face, like a mirror that mocked him. The captain gave the order to fire, and the navigator opened fire. Bursts of light cutting through the shadows, striking the figures. But instead of falling, the creatures twisted and reformed, their bodies rippling like water disturbed by a stone. They made no sound, no cry of pain, only the whispers growing louder. The engineer shouted that they had to get to the ship, and the captain agreed, shouting for retreat. They ran, weapons firing, the creatures shifting around them, closing the path, but the humans pushed forward with desperate strength. They reached the ship's ramp, the captain pulling his crew inside as the navigator fired one last burst to keep the things back. The ramp closed, sealing them inside, but the whispers did not stop. They filled the cabin now, pouring through the walls, crawling into their heads. The engineer rushed to the controls, powering up the ship, engines roaring as they lifted off the ground. The colony shrank below them, but what they saw as they rose made their blood turn cold. The pit at the center of the mines was no longer still. It was opening wider, tearing the ground apart, and from its depths something vast was rising. The shadow they had seen before was only a fragment. Now the full shape emerged, a structure that looked like both machine and creature, alive yet built, its surface covered in shifting patterns like veins of light. It reached upward, higher than the colony towers, its form so massive it bent the land around it. The beacon pulsed in rhythm with its movement, each flash shaking the air, sending waves through the stars. The navigator whispered that this was what had happened to the colony. This was what had happened to the other fleets. The beacon was not a cry for help. It was bait. A trap. The captain's chest tightened as the truth became clear. The distress signal had been a lure, designed to draw ships in, to feed the thing that waited beneath. The humans were not rescuers. They were prey. The engineer shouted that the scanners were going wild. The creature was emitting signals across every frequency, reaching far beyond the system. It was calling, not just to them but to the entire galaxy. The captain clenched his fists, realizing the horror. Every ship within range would hear the signal, would come searching, and would be swallowed just as the others had been. The ship broke free of the atmosphere, but the creature's presence followed them, its whispers clawing into their minds. The navigator cried out, clutching her head, saying she could see images, flashes of other ships, other crews, being dragged into the darkness, their voices stolen, their bodies twisted into those shadow figures they had seen. The engineer swore, begging the captain to shut it out, but there was no way. The captain gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus, shouting for them to push the engines harder. Their ship burned through the upper atmosphere, but then alarms screamed. Something had locked onto them. A pulse of energy struck the hull, shaking the entire craft. The engineer yelled that the systems were failing, the power was draining, as if something was feeding on them. The captain ordered all power to the engines, ignoring everything else. The ship roared, shuddering as it forced itself forward, breaking free of the pull, climbing into the black of space. For a moment, it seemed they had escaped. But then the comms crackled again. A voice came through, soft and broken, the same one they had heard before in the colony, the voice that had begged for help. Only now it was clear, and it spoke words that froze their blood. It said, "We are waiting." The crew stared at each other, their hearts pounding. The captain forced himself to focus, shouting to cut the signal, but the engineer said it was impossible. The voice was not coming through their comms anymore. It was inside the ship. The lights flickered, the walls shook, and the navigator screamed that something was on board. The captain drew his weapon, his body cold with fear, as the whispers rose to a roar. They had escaped the colony, but the horror had followed them. The ship shook violently as the whispers filled every corner of the cabin, a storm of voices that crawled through the metal and into their minds. The captain shouted for his crew to stay focused, but even his voice felt drowned under the sound. The navigator gripped her console, her eyes wide, whispering that she could see things, not outside the ship but inside her head, visions of stars turning black, fleets consumed, galaxies burning. The engineer slammed his fists against the controls, forcing systems to respond, rerouting power again and again as if fighting something alive inside the ship. The lights flickered, the air filled with the sound of groaning metal, and then the alarms screamed once more. A shadow appeared outside their window, vast and formless, stretching across the stars like a living void. The creature had not been left behind on the colony. It had followed them into space, its form twisting, shifting, bending reality as it closed the distance. The captain shouted for evasive maneuvers, and the navigator pulled hard on the controls, the ship lurching to one side, engines burning as they spun away. But no matter how far they ran, the shadow followed, always behind them, never slowing. It was not chasing like a predator that hunted. It was moving like a tide, unstoppable, endless, as if it could not be outrun. The engineer screamed that the engines were overheating, that the power drain was too strong. The captain snapped back, ordering him to push harder, that slowing down meant death. The ship roared, tearing through space, systems red with warning lights. The navigator tried to lock a course out of the system, but the controls kept flickering, their path twisting, pulled off course as if the stars themselves were moving against them. The captain realized with horror that the thing was bending space around them, reshaping their path, forcing them back toward the dead colony. The navigator shouted that she could not hold the course, that something was pulling them like gravity but stronger, unnatural. The captain slammed his hand against the console, demanding they fight it, that humans did not give up. The engineer yelled that he had one idea, but it was dangerous. He could overload the engines, push them past braking, maybe tear through whatever force was dragging them back. But if he failed, the ship would rip apart. The captain hesitated only a second before ordering him to do it. Better to risk everything than be dragged into the pit below. The engineer ran to the core systems, his hands flying over the controls, sweat dripping inside his helmet. The navigator gritted her teeth, trying to hold the ship steady as the shadow closed in. The captain watched through the window, his heart pounding, as tendrils of darkness reached out from the void, stretching toward them like hands. The whispers grew louder, turning into words now, words that spoke in broken human voices. Come back. Stay. We are waiting. The crew shouted against the sound, their voices shaking as they fought the terror pressing into their skulls. The engineer screamed that the overload was ready. The captain gave the order, and the ship roared with sudden power, the engines flaring brighter than they ever had before. The cabin shook, the hull groaned as if it would split, and then the stars stretched into lines as the ship ripped forward. For a moment, silence returned. The shadow behind them seemed to fade, the whispers breaking apart into static. The navigator gasped, her hands trembling as she pulled them out of the forced course. They were free, moving away from the system, the dead colony shrinking into the distance. The crew slumped in their seats, exhausted, their bodies shaking with fear and relief. But the captain did not relax. He stared at the stars ahead, his jaw tight. The whispers were gone, but only for now. He knew the thing was not destroyed. It was still there, waiting, and it had marked them. The engineer confirmed his fear. The scans showed traces of something still clinging to their ship, invisible energy patterns that moved like parasites. The creature had touched them, and it had not let go. The navigator whispered that they were cursed now, that no matter where they ran, it would find them again. The captain silenced her, but inside he knew she was right. Then the comms crackled once more. A voice came through, not the broken cry they had heard before but a chorus, dozens of voices speaking together, all human, all crying in unison. It said, "We are part of it now. You will be too." The engineer slammed the comms off, his hands shaking, but the sound remained in their heads even after the channel was closed. The captain stood, steadying himself against the shaking floor. He told his crew they could not run forever. If the thing was chasing them, they would have to find a way to fight it. The navigator stared at him in disbelief, saying nothing could fight something like that. The engineer shook his head, muttering that they were only a small crew with one fragile ship, not a fleet. But the captain's eyes were hard. He reminded them that humans had faced impossible odds before, that every empire in the galaxy had once underestimated them and regretted it. The silence after his words was heavy, but slowly the navigator nodded, and even the engineer forced himself to stand straighter. The captain returned to his seat, his mind racing. The chase was not over. It had only begun. The ship drifted through the dark, its hull scarred, its engines weak after the desperate escape, but the crew did not rest. The captain sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the stars, his mind racing with thoughts of the creature that still hunted them. He knew it was only a matter of time before the whispers returned, before the shadow found them again. Running was not enough. If they wanted to survive, they would have to fight. The navigator argued that fighting something like that was madness, that no weapon they carried could harm it, that even fleets had vanished into its trap. The engineer muttered that she was right, that their ship was too small, their weapons too weak, and their power too low. But the captain refused to accept defeat. He told them that humans had always survived because they never gave up, even when the odds were impossible. They had no choice but to make a stand. The crew stared at him, fear and doubt in their eyes, but slowly they began to understand. If they ran, they would die. If they hid, they would be found. But if they fought, at least they had a chance. The engineer started to work on the ship's systems, tearing open panels, rerouting power, building traps with what little they had. He spoke of turning their engines into weapons, of overloading the reactor in bursts to create blasts of energy. The navigator worked beside him, programming false signals, lures to confuse the creature, hoping to use the same trick it had used on others. The captain planned their stand, choosing a small moon on the edge of a dead system, a place where they could draw the creature in and strike. The ship landed in the shadows of the rocks, the crew moving quickly, setting charges, rigging explosives, turning every piece of metal into something deadly. They were not soldiers, but they worked with the desperation of people who knew the end was close. Days passed in silence, each moment heavy with tension, waiting for the whispers to return. And then they did. At first, faint, soft, almost like a memory. Then louder, clearer, filling their heads, calling their names. The shadow appeared on the edge of their scanners, vast and endless, stretching across the void as it came closer. The crew took their positions, the captain standing at the center, his weapon in hand, his eyes fixed on the stars. The engineer muttered that the systems were ready, that everything was armed, though he was not sure if it would be enough. The navigator whispered a prayer, her hands steady on the controls. The captain gave the order. The ship lit up, its false signals blazing across space, beacons firing in every direction. The creature shifted, turning toward them, its massive form folding and twisting like a storm of darkness. The trap was sprung. The charges exploded across the moon's surface, blasting shards of rock into space, tearing at the shadow's edges. The ship's engines roared, flaring bursts of overloaded power that struck like lightning, cutting into the creature's form. For the first time, it reacted. The whispers rose into a scream, filling the crew's heads with pain, but they did not stop. The navigator fired every weapon they had, missiles, cannons, anything that could burn through the black. The engineer triggered the reactor bursts again and again, pushing the ship to the edge of destruction. The creature shuddered, its form twisting, breaking apart and reforming, but now it seemed less perfect, less untouchable. The captain shouted for them to keep going, to press the attack. The ship darted through the shadow, weaving between its tendrils, firing in all directions. Explosions lit the dark, shaking the stars. The whispers screamed, trying to break their minds, showing them visions of death, of endless black, of themselves twisted into the same shadow figures they had seen on the colony. But the crew fought through the terror, clinging to their rage, to their defiance. Humans were not prey. They were survivors. They were fighters. The engineer shouted that the reactor was reaching critical, that one more burst might destroy them as well. The captain ordered him to prepare it anyway. Better to die striking a blow than be consumed. The navigator locked the ship on course, straight into the heart of the shadow. The creature loomed around them, its form closing, its voice a roar that shook their very bones. At the last moment, the captain gave the command, and the reactor flared one final time. A blast of pure energy tore through the darkness, ripping the creature's form apart, shattering it into fragments that scattered across the stars. The ship was thrown clear, spinning out of control, alarms screaming as systems failed. The crew held on, praying the hull would hold. Then silence. The stars returned. The shadow was gone. The crew slumped in their seats, exhausted, their bodies weak, but their eyes wide with disbelief. They had struck it. They had hurt it. The captain's voice was low but steady as he said that the galaxy had always feared the whispers, had always believed the creature could not be fought. But tonight, humans had proved them wrong. The navigator whispered that it was not destroyed, only wounded, and the engineer agreed. The traces still lingered, faint on the scanners, scattered but alive. It would return. The captain nodded. But now the galaxy would know the truth. The creature could bleed. It could be fought. And when it came again, humanity would be ready. The ship drifted in silence, its hull scarred, its engines barely holding together, but inside the crew sat awake, their eyes heavy with exhaustion yet alive with something new, something that felt like fire. They had faced the shadow, they had fought the whispers, and though they had not destroyed it, they had hurt it. That alone was a victory greater than any story they had heard in the dark corners of spaceports. The captain sat at the front, his hands gripping the console, his gaze locked on the stars ahead. He knew the thing would return, that what they had seen on the colony and in the pit was only a fragment of something older and larger than they could understand. But now the galaxy would know it was not untouchable. The navigator whispered that they should send a warning, not just to human worlds but to every empire, every fleet, even those who had long looked down on humanity. The engineer hesitated, saying that sending a signal would also reveal their position, and the creature might find them again faster. The captain shook his head. Fear would not save them. Silence would not protect them. The only path forward was to speak. He gave the order, and the engineer began to patch the comm system, rerouting damaged circuits, pulling power from every remaining source. Sparks flew, the ship groaned, but slowly the system came alive. The navigator leaned forward, her voice steady but low, asking what they should say. The captain thought for a long moment, the weight of the galaxy pressing on his shoulders. Then he began to speak. His voice carried across the comms, across the dark void, across every frequency the ship could reach. He told the story of the distress signal, of the colony that had vanished, of the shadow that waited in the pit, and of the fleets that had been swallowed without a trace. He spoke of the whispers, the false cries for help, the traps that had lured countless ships to their doom. And then he told them of the fight. Of how a single human crew, with one fragile ship, had stood against the darkness and wounded it. His words were sharp, steady, filled with defiance. He told the galaxy that the creature was real, that it was still out there, and that it would come again. But he also told them that it could bleed, that it could be fought, that it was not a god, not an endless storm, not untouchable. He told them that it feared what humans carried inside them, the refusal to break, the fire that burned even when hope was gone. The message spread, carried on channels both legal and illegal, through traders and pirates, through fleets and colonies, reaching ears that had long dismissed humanity as weak. In the halls of alien empires, rulers listened with unease, their advisors whispering of ancient myths, of monsters in the dark that no one dared name. In the ships of wandering traders, crews listened and felt their skin crawl, for many had lost friends to strange signals and had never known why. Now they had an answer. The story of one human crew spread faster than the whispers themselves, and with it came fear, but also something more dangerous, hope. Meanwhile, in the silence of space, the shadow stirred. The fragments that had been torn apart by the human ship began to gather again, drifting through the void, pulling themselves together like blood returning to a wound. The whispers grew faint at first, then louder, echoing across the stars, promising that the game was not over. On the small, broken ship, the captain knew this too. He sat quietly after sending the signal, his crew beside him, their eyes tired but burning with the same fire. The navigator asked softly if he thought anyone would believe them. The captain answered that belief did not matter. The truth had been spoken, and the galaxy could no longer hide from it. The engineer asked if they would survive long enough to see what came next. The captain looked at the stars and said survival was not enough anymore. Humanity had been marked, and now it was time to stand. The ship drifted forward, broken but alive, carrying a crew that had done what no one else had dared. And as the shadow rebuilt itself in the distance, stretching across the stars, the galaxy shivered. For the first time, the predator had been wounded. For the first time, the whispers had been answered. And for the first time, the galaxy realized a terrible truth, that the smallest of its species, the humans, might be the only ones willing to fight the dark. The captain sat back, his eyes fixed on the black horizon, and whispered words only his crew could hear. He said, "We are not prey. We are the hunters now." The ship's engines flickered, sparks of light breaking through the void, and the humans carried their fire into the endless dark, leaving behind a galaxy that would never be the same.